Welcome. Hi. My name is Anthony Cimolino. I'm the artistic director here at the Stratford Festival. I want to welcome all of you here to... that wasn't my mom. I want to welcome you all, not only here in the Studio Theatre, but our audiences around the world, because we are live streaming today's event, and it will be later broadcast on CBC Radio's Ideas program. And we have a very, very exciting event for you today with a group of extraordinarily accomplished individuals to discuss the topic of migration, nativism, and identity. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the land, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. And that fact was very much in my mind as I put together the plays for this season under the theme of identity. 2017 is the 150th anniversary of Confederation. And of course, we want to celebrate that fact. But it struck me that there were many nations here for the thousands of years before there was Canada. And I began to think about identity and its permanence, or how quickly it goes, our personal identity versus our collective identity, what brings us together, and how identity can sometimes take us apart. Is identity at odds with diversity? And I put together a series of plays under that umbrella. And it has struck me in the 18 months since, programming a season on the theme of identity, how much that same theme has come up time and again in referendums and elections around the world. Now, today, as I said, we have some terrific people to discuss this issue. We have undertaken this particular event in a partnership with the Munk School of Global Affairs. And the driving force in organizing today's event is Deanna Horton, a brilliant individual. I'm going to introduce Deanna, and she's going to be the moderator who will then introduce the panelists. Now, Deanna has worked for Canadian Foreign Affairs around the world. She's had stations in Hamburg and Tokyo, in Washington. Of course, she's done many stints in Ottawa, helping to coordinate our affairs around the world. She is a fellow of the Munk School. And I first met her when she was in Washington as the minister responsible for congressional and public and intergovernmental affairs there. And she really is extraordinary. Now, after a lifetime traveling the world, she has had the wisdom to treat herself and move here to Stratford. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, if you're looking for a friend or a neighbor, you cannot do better. Please welcome Deanna Horton.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and to everyone who's here today. I'm going to begin by introducing the panelists today. Doug Saunders, first of all, international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. I'm sure you know that. He's author of 2 books that are very relevant to today's discussion. One is called Arrival City, The Final Migration on Our Next World, and the other one is The Myth of the Muslim Tide. He served as the paper's London-based European bureau chief for a decade after having run the paper's Los Angeles bureau, and has written extensively from East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and North Africa. He writes a weekly column devoted to the larger themes and intellectual concepts behind international news, and he's a 5-time winner of the National Newspaper Award. Doug Saunders' writing about politics and culture has frequently used the theater as its entry point. Highlights include extended interviews with Václav Havel, Kevin Spacey, and Kirk Douglas. He takes to heart Arthur Miller's maxim, in order to govern, politicians must first learn how to act. I know, that's pretty funny. Next, I'm going to go to Randall Hansen in the middle. He is the interim director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, and he will be stepping into Stephen Toope's shoes. He's a professor of political science working on immigration and citizenship, demography and population policy, and the effects of war on civilians, and he's published many works on those topics. You may have seen him on news programs of late commenting on the recent UK election, and Randall received his doctorate from Harvard. He is a keen theater goer who links each trip to London with a visit to the West End. He was first hooked by Maggie Smith as Lady Bracknell in a 1992 performance of The Importance of Being Earnest, but political theater, particularly David Hare, is now his favorite. And then last but not least, Stephen Toope. Now, Stephen Toope is the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, but in fact, I want to extend a particular welcome to him because this may be one of his last public appearances before he's heading off to Cambridge, and this is not Cambridge near Stratford. He's going to be the 346th Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. So Stephen has just received an honorary doctorate from McGill University, adding to others from the University of Alberta and UNC. He is also an officer of the Order of Canada. I could go on and on about my three panelists here, but let's get to some questions. But before I get to that, please remember that we will be welcoming your questions. So I hope you have received cards from the ushers, and we'll be getting to those after we start. So let's start with you, Randall. Migration, people shipwrecked in unknown places, mistaken identity. All are common themes in Shakespearean plays, including Twelfth Night. So Canada does have asylum seekers crossing its borders, but that's really dwarfed by the waves of immigration in Europe. So how are European countries responding to the mass arrival of refugees, and will that be sufficient to solve the global challenge? And what implications does that have for Canada?
Okay. Well, the answer is a combination of well and badly. Let's start with well. We'll begin with the optimistic element. The generosity that some Europeans, the Germans in particular, along with the Swedes and the Austrians, showed towards refugees in 2015, 2016, was quite extraordinary. And to tie that back to Canada, we took in 25,000, and we were desperately patting ourselves on the back, giving ourselves a big Canadian hug over our generosity. The Germans took almost 1 million. So the numbers just don't compare. That said, after they took in that figure, they slammed the door pretty quickly, partly for domestic political reasons, partly because they lacked the capacity to admit anywhere near the number of refugees who are in need of assistance. And that's the key point. 86% of the world's refugees are in the global south. The problem will not be solved in Europe because most refugees will never go to Europe. It has to be solved in the global south where most refugees are: Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere. Sorry, not Syria. They're fleeing Syria. Though, actually, that's not entirely incorrect because another related problem to refugees is internally displaced persons who are refugees in almost every respect, except that they stay within the country. They don't cross the borders. Now, what can Canada do? That was the second part of your question. Well, despite my slightly sniffy comments about the 25,000, there were good things about it. First, an extraordinary engagement of Canadian civil society. It's one of the few times I've ever seen where a government looked like it was going to lose votes, the Harper Conservatives, for being insufficiently generous towards refugees. And it bought this country an extraordinary degree of political capital globally. I've been to many, many symposia discussing migration and citizenship, and the two countries constantly cited as the most generous are Germany and Canada, as if you could drop both in a bag and pick either one out and it would make no difference. Now is the time to press home that advantage. This country could take leadership on this issue, above all since the United States has exited it. That will require commitment on the part of Freeland and Trudeau, and it will require money.
So Randall, thanks very much. And Doug, you've just come back from Europe, so I'm sure you have some views on this.
I seem to constantly be spending time in Europe talking to people about strategies for fitting refugees into their societies in those handful of countries that actually are taking refugees in Europe. We have to understand that what refugees mean and what the refugee crisis means is something very different in European countries than it is in Canada, and it's very different among different European countries. In Canada, we have a tradition dating back to the late 1950s of resettling refugees who've been forced to flee their countries because of war, and our most famous means of doing so is through private sponsorship. I mean, I co-sponsor a Syrian family and help build them an apartment, all this sort of stuff. And that's a limited and controlled program that Canada does. Occasionally, a handful of people will show up in a boat, or a few hundred will walk across the border from the United States and claim refugee status from there. But that's a small part. And refugees are typically maybe 5% of our immigration numbers. They may have risen to 10%. I think by the time we finished last year, we settled more like 75,000 Syrian refugees, but they were handpicked. They were a poorer group than those who come to Europe because we were resettling them from camps in Jordan and Turkey, whereas those who come to Europe tend to have crossed in those infamous rubber rafts, which cost about €3,000 per person. So it tends to be a self-selected group who are better. But here's the European situation. You really only have 2.5 countries that are accepting refugees in any substantial number. As Randall said, Germany, which saw 1 million people cross its border, some of whom are refugees. Sweden, which both accepted from internal movement and resettled hundreds of thousands of refugees. And Austria was reasonably accepting in policy. Really, no other European country is accepting more than a token number. Some, such as Poland and Hungary, have aggressively gone to war against the idea of accepting even one refugee. And in fact, there's a big challenge going on in the EU right now, which there was an agreement on quotas in 2015 that really no countries have adhered to. UK is having its own thing going on and isn't really taking any significant numbers, and France isn't. And it's regarded as an unfair burden, and you have a couple problems. First of all, you still have people moving across the Mediterranean. And arriving in Greece and Italy, which are not places where refugees really want to settle and where they really should. But because of European policies, they're technically supposed to seek asylum in the first place that they land. They then do in somewhere else, such as Germany, where there's actually an economy and networks of existing people. And you see a couple problems. First of all, Germany faces this like no one else. Germany wanted a lot of refugees for a while. They saw they recognized that 1 million people were going to cross the border because they were walking across Europe. I guess Angela Merkel probably had 2 thoughts in her mind when she saw that. She knew that there was a lot of political pressure for her to shut down the border and not let these people in. Her first thought was probably, I do not want to be the German chancellor who created photos of hundreds of thousands of children being blocked at the border, because it was only a few decades ago that the world's largest refugee crisis took place, which involved tens of millions of Europeans, including the plurality of Germans. That's what gave us the modern word refugee and its meaning. And second of all, Germany, and to a lesser extent Sweden, saw a potential solution to a problem they had, which was a huge demographic problem. They needed new people. Germany has been taking in 800,000 immigrants per year for the last decade or more, and has recognized the need for more people. It's going to face, its working age labor force is going to lose 10 million people over the next 10 years. And there was people in both political parties who governed together, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, who saw the refugees as an opportunity, who said, let's plug these units of labor into this hole. I don't think it's a wise idea. I don't think refugees are a good way to handle that. I don't think a lot of European countries, including Germany, recognize what Canadians have slowly come to recognize, which is that refugees need to be turned into regular immigrants and then into citizens as quickly as possible, or their temporary mindset's a problem. Europeans are still reeling from the last refugee crisis, which was in the 1990s, which involved about 3 million people from the former Yugoslavia walking northward to European countries. Numerically, probably still a larger crisis than the current one for most of the countries involved, and which was handled very badly. They were people from different religions and cultures who were seen as civilizational threats, and in a war that seemed destined to go on forever. The fact that it ended abruptly in 2000 with the end of Milosevic meant that ended, but that 2/3 of those people ended up moving back. And that lesson hasn't been learned properly. And the final thing I should add to that is that complicates it is that there haven't been as many refugees as many countries expected. The 1 million people who came into Germany, somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 have applied for refugee status under the 1951 UN Charter. And some of them will be accepted under that. There are now complaints coming from Germany that they've built way too much refugee shelters and that they're not being filled and so on. So you have a bunch of situations that are unlike anything Canada faces, involving a lot of people wandering about Europe who can't be deported easily, who aren't quite recognized, and countries not bearing the burden. That's created a political crisis in some countries. And we can talk about this later, but it's in many ways it's surprising it's not created more of a political crisis.
So, Stephen, you're heading off to the UK, which has been reeling both from Brexit and the recent UK election. So any comments on that or the refugee migration issue globally?
I'm not going to talk about the UK. There's just so much to say, and none of it's very positive in many ways. I want to pick up Randall's point about the real challenge here being in the global south, and I just want to give that a little flavor. Aside from all of the recent refugee resettlement issues that we've been following for the last couple of years, there are refugee camps in northern Kenya that have been there for decades, where children are born and grown up and don't get educated, for example. Hundreds of thousands of people in Dadaab, etc. And then we have similar problems on the Thai border. We have problems in Central Africa. This is a worldwide crisis. It's not really about Europe, although because of the way we tend to look at the world, we fixate more commonly on places that look more like us, I think, and that's natural. I don't complain about it. But I think we have to be very careful to keep our eye focused on where the real risk for the future is. And I think that is hundreds of thousands of people growing up in camps that don't have education and that have no sense of hope going forward. And we look at generations of young men and women who will be coming into the world with no prospect of ever having employment.
Yeah.
Or even citizenship.
Or citizenship. And so I would love us to think, yes, about Europe. Of course it's important, and the politics of that is very complicated, but we also have to be looking at what the United Nations has to do in relation to all of these other refugee situations. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is constantly under huge pressure, can't provide the resources that are necessary, and I think this is a moment where collective action that includes countries like Canada is more important than ever.
Well, maybe we could get a little bit into demographics, since I know you're all interested in this. But, you know, you would think that the global south has too many people. The global north is rapidly aging, is going to be facing demographic crises in the future. Is there a possible solution out there? Is migration the solution?
Well, I'll start just by saying that I don't think that migration can actually be the solution to all of these demographic problems. For one thing, China is about to experience a deficit demographically, and that is going to change the dynamic for everyone. India is still growing, and that will have important implications, but I think that, yes, some movement has to be required. It's a kind of safety valve. It always has been. But I don't think most people who grow up in a particular place want to leave their home unless generally they're forced into it, either through violence or through the lack of economic opportunity or political repression. So it does seem to me that that's where we should be spending our time, not really trying to cherry pick a few people from various parts of the world to come to our countries to solve internal problems.
Yeah, I should also hopefully disabuse people of the notion that the countries that are experiencing out of control population growth are bursting at the seams and looking to send people to the Western world or something. In fact, the countries that experience the largest population growth are among the least likely to send immigrants to other countries. I mean, Niger is probably the biggest example. It probably has the largest family size, and it sends almost no immigrants to, it's within its own region it does, but across, it tends to be once countries have reached a certain level of development and a certain control. You have to reach a certain level of prosperity to start sending immigrants, even when you fall into conflict and so on. Syria did not have out-of-control population growth. It had family sizes that I think were close to the 2.1 point where your population stops growing. It had sort of French-level family size, and so on. So it tends to be. This is a handful of countries. There are fewer than 20 countries in the world that have the sort of situations to be sending refugees. There are actually fewer countries than ever in history that have the sort of conflicts that will send immigrants. But you have a handful that are creating problems. And this is not a persistent problem that's going to go on for decades or something like that. We've seen little spikes of refugees. We saw a spike in the 80s caused by the Lebanon war. And then we saw it go down to very low levels. We saw a spike in the 90s caused by the Yugoslavia war. We're talking here about refugees coming to the West. And then between about 2000 and this decade, refugee flows fell to their lowest level in recorded history to the West, to negligible, almost insignificant numbers. And now we're seeing a spike caused by this conflict. So it helps to understand the politics of this, to understand that these are a few crises and spikes caused by a few countries. This is not a case of the world expanding into like a balloon and bursting.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, it's a function of, it's not demographics, it's not population growth, it's not hunger, it's not, despite what the UN says, climate change, it's war. It's war and institutional breakdown, and that's where you get refugees. I just want to make a couple of comments. Into Europe very quickly and out again. My only slight disagreement with Doug on this is that I think the Europeans are getting this right this time, particularly the Germans, because they are placing the emphasis squarely on work and on getting the refugees trained and into work as quickly as possible. The Germans, incidentally, love us. They think Canada gets everything right about immigration.
They're obsessed, yes.
They are obsessed. And when they talk to me about this, I say, ignore multiculturalism. It doesn't matter very much unless you live in the annex. What Canadians get absolutely right is the emphasis in our immigration programs on, well, we select people that are skilled, so that gives us an advantage, but on getting people into work as quickly as possible. The Germans have got that right. And I want to pick up on Stephen's comments and Diana's. Demographically, no, I agree entirely. This won't be a solution. I think movements can deal with short-term labor shortages, which ease demographic change. It won't solve the problem, and frankly, we don't know if there's going to be a problem. There are two narratives at the moment that are completely contradictory. One is our populations are declining, and we desperately need population growth via immigration or birth or whatever. The other is because of automation and globalization, particularly automation, there's going to be no jobs for everyone. Well, both these cannot be true at once, and they're often said by exactly the same people. We might in fact find the high-tech countries with stagnant populations like Japan and Germany are better equipped to cope with this than others, but we just don't know. Last comment, Stephen's absolutely right. We need action in the global south. It's not just in the camps. I mean, in the case of Turkey, only 2.6 million out of 260,000 out of 3.2 million, about 10%, are in camps. The rest have disappeared into the cities. We need a global compact where we recognize they're going to remain in the south. The north puts up the money so that they can be incorporated, integrated into education, into work, given rights to mobility in the global south. And that's the only chance we have of licking this problem.
Good point. I want to steer the conversation a little bit towards identity. So I'm focusing now on the play Komagata Maru, which is going to be playing here in Stratford. So this revolves around Canadian identity and the turning away of migrants who, despite their British citizenship, were denied entry into Canada. The true story about the Komagata Maru was also about Canadian identity as being white. And the lead character in the play is in denial about his mixed race identity. So in some parts of the world today, Nativism appears to be on the rise, Is this because of a fear of economic disenfranchisement or a wish to return, for example, in the case of the Netherlands, to a past that is populated by whites?
Well, I'll start with that. I'm sure most people here know that this whole notion of race is, in many ways, a false construct, right? There is no clarity as between races, and notions of purity in religion and in politics have always created enormous tensions. So I always worry about any claims around desired racial purity. I think in the Canadian context, as Randall points out, one of the things that's been most successful in the so-called multicultural experiment has been Canada's ability to pick and choose amongst the people who are coming into the country through the point systems that have been created. And so we've tended to have overall rather skilled immigrants coming to the country from a diverse set of source countries. If you look at this resistance that seems to have evolved to racial quotes, and I think it's largely cultural change rather than racial, in places like the Netherlands and elsewhere, first off, I think that there's a kind of falsity about the claim that there ever was something that was pure. The greatest example of this for me is Japan. People think of Japan as a monolithic culture. Anyone who looks at Japan knows that much of the origin of Japanese culture is actually Korean. And aside from that, there's great diversity within Japan from north to south. So it isn't a monolithic culture in the way it sometimes projects. I really worry about the claims that have been made in some recent elections that what's really happening is that people who are disenfranchised, finding themselves economically disempowered, are somehow reacting to that. If you look, and I have to raise the question of the election in our neighbor to the south, if you actually look at the data that's been produced since the election, the single greatest indicators of whether or not one would vote for President Trump related to one's attitude towards race and one's attitude towards immigration. It had very little to do with one's economic status or one's actual ability to earn. I think that that's generally true. I think that what we're often seeing in these recent elections is claims around economic disenfranchisement, which are actually allowing for older claims around race to be resuscitated. And frankly, I find that disturbing.
I think when I look at the rise of these parties of intolerance and candidates of intolerance, which is maybe the best way to describe them. I think there's, in both Europe and the United States, there's sort of three phenomena at work. I'm going to start with the least well-noted one, which is that in the last maybe 4 or 5 decades, there has been an erosion of loyalty to the big monolithic political parties that tended to govern. I mean, most Europeans of the last generation voted for Christian Democrats or Social Democrats, almost like people in this part of Ontario are loyal to Ford or Chevy or Dodge, right? I mean, if your parents did, you probably did. If your neighborhood did, you probably also did. And to a large extent, that was also true in the United States of the Republican Party, then the Democratic Party, certainly in Britain of Labour and the Tories. And we've seen an erosion of those loyalties, which I would say has exploded this year in what political scientists call a historic realignment, right? What did we just see happen in France? We saw the two monolithic political parties that had dominated life there since the 70s basically disappear from the ballot completely. The Socialist Party and the party that was known as the UMP and is now known as the Republicans and now basically is gone, all but vanished both in the presidential election ballots and now in the parliamentary legislative election. In Britain, both, as we just saw in this election, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party no longer have become sort of tied to fringe opinions on the sides of their parties, and no longer, neither of them is capable of winning an electoral majority or forming a majority coalition under really any sustainable standards. The United States, of course, the Democrats and the Republicans, both are fragmenting at the seams, and there's a president who's not really from either of those parties or who campaigned against both of those parties. And you can see it in a lot of other places as well, that sort of fragmentation. That's a big part of what's caused people to vote for those parties. Second, you see a slow secular rise over about 50 years for willingness of older white people to vote for extremist parties or populist parties or parties of isolationism and so on, or parties of ethnic identity. That tolerance probably was damped down after the war for quite some time. There was a never again sensibility, but the number of people who don't say never again anymore has slowly risen. And you're not, there's been some good analyses in Britain suggesting that there hasn't been a sudden spike up of these things, that if you remove the sort of ups and downs that happen, people will always tell pollsters that they're going to vote for an extremist party a few months before the election and then it dies down. If you level those things out, it's been a slow rise to maybe in some countries 1 out of 5 people are willing to. And third of all, of course, is the one that gets talked about more often, which is the mood of intolerance and displacement among some certain population. As Stephen says, it's not the people who have actually lost jobs because of the post-industrial economy. Some of them, yes, but it's much more people who feel they're not part of it. It tends to be people who don't have a university education. It tends to be people who are white. It tends to be people who are somewhat older. And most significantly, it tends to be people who do not live in diverse places. The people who are voting for these parties, whether it's Donald Trump in the United States, or whether it's people who voted in the Brexit referendum in Britain, or people who are voting for the Front National or Alternative for Germany, or the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, are people who live in neighborhoods where almost everyone is like them, or where if there are immigrants or religious minorities, they've only arrived during the last 10 or 15 years or so they haven't become part of the community. People who actually live with this supposed threat around them don't vote for these parties. To an overwhelming degree, they don't. And I think that combination of circumstances, a political realignment, a slight rising tolerance, and some sense of fear among people who maybe see it in the media and don't experience the thing they're supposedly fearing, are adding up to this phenomenon. It has not yet been a majority in any country, including the United States, of course. Yeah. A majority of the population has not voted for an extremist of the left or the right in any country in the Western world. You could say some things about Hungary, but generally speaking, this is the thing. And if you were going to be optimistic, you could point out to the fact that the people who are not part of those three phenomena I just mentioned are a majority and are in most countries are a demographically increasing group.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. The only thing I would add to that, we're showing our age here, is we haven't said enough about Twitter and technology. Mm-hmm. Twitter has empowered every racist lowlife with access to a keyboard, the ability to spout the most racist at the moment, generally Islamophobic, though sometimes anti-Semitic, nonsense with caricatures of Muslims that recall the 1930s, the eternal Muslim having substituted for the eternal Jew. And so that I think fed into the US presidential election in a way that none of us expected. And that relates to another point. I agree entirely on the party system. We might see it splitting. The Conservative Party might be splitting in the United Kingdom in a way it has not since Home Rule in Ireland or the Corn Laws of the 19th century. But coming back to Trump, we were also caught napping. The populist, racist, and it was racist, let's not pretend it was anything else, rhetoric was allowed to fester. Centrist parties didn't challenge it head on. They said, well, this reflects legitimate concerns about immigration. That was a phrase you would hear quite often. And what we've seen recently, I was very worried after the election of Trump and after Brexit, because liberals were kind of falling on their back, going paws up around the world, saying, oh, we got it wrong, and we live in this bubble, and we're terribly sorry, and we didn't understand. I thought that was complete nonsense at the time and said so, and it's emerged to be nonsense. First, for the reasons that Stephen outlined. It actually wasn't the poorest of the poor who were voting for these guys. And secondly, what we saw in France, above all in France with Macron, and to a degree with Corbyn, who's really not my cup of tea, but nonetheless with Corbyn in the United Kingdom, is a liberal/social democratic fight back. Macron destroyed the Front National by defending Europe, the European Union, the values of the Enlightenment, and an open pro-immigration society. And frankly, we need more, not less of that.
And if I could just pick up on that, it's so easy to construct a narrative of rising populism, nativism all across Europe and North America. But aside from France, if you look at the upcoming German election,
Yeah, absolutely.
even if Madame Merkel loses, she's going to lose to a social democratic party that is as much or even more committed to all of the things that Randall just talked about. So there is pushback here, and it's powerful pushback in important places.
That's true, but what about Hungary?
Yeah, what about Hungary? And
What about Poland?
if you know, and in terms of attitudes, if you look at maps of Europe, and I'm often a defender of places like Poland, which if you spend any amount of time there, you come up usually very optimistic because it's the urban, youthful population are very pro-European and have a sense of optimism that's very hopeful. Poland, the problem is that the majority of the country is still rural and still not very well connected to the world and still very susceptible to the ideas of parties that appeal to a religious and ethnic message, you could say, who govern currently. But if you look at a map of Europe by attitudes toward religious minorities, and in fact, if you look at a map of Europe, let's even disregard Muslims for a moment and say mapped by attitudes toward Jews, people who will agree to statements like there's a Jewish conspiracy to run the world economy and that sort of thing. In Britain, it's sort of like 6 or 7%. In the Netherlands, similar. In France, a lot like that. Then you get into sort of Austria and so on, it gets up to like 20% and so on. And suddenly in Poland and Hungary, it's like 60, 70% of people will feel that thing. Now, keep in mind, it's precisely the opposite, and speaking to what we were just talking about with the contact hypothesis, the idea that people living near groups don't vote for opposition. If you look at a map of Europe according to its Jewish population or its Muslim population, it's precisely the opposite of that, right? The largest group of Jews and Muslims live in France, in Europe, like half the population, and Britain and...
Not in France.
Half the population of Jews
not half the
and
population.
Muslims in Europe.
Yeah. Live in France. Not half the French.
Arab-tide people will pick up that statistic.
Not trying to spread further conspiracy theories. And that number gets down to, until you get to those countries of Central and Eastern Europe where for historical tragic reasons do not have any Jewish population and not very many religious minorities. And again, there's a phenomenon that they call anti-Semitism without Jews, which is the places with the fewest of a group tend to be the most fearful that they're being taken over by that group. And you do get that, and I do worry about those countries. Those countries are in a paradoxical phenomenon because the European Union is freaking out right now that Hungary and Poland are sort of falling off the political edge into intolerant extremism and so on. On the other hand, those countries, I have a feeling that as Eurosceptic as their leaders get, they're not going to leave the European Union. And because their economies are extremely reliant on those connections to the rest of Europe. Mind you, the UK's economy is also highly reliant. I'm also very skeptical that the UK will ever actually end up fully leaving the European Union. Words I might end up eating. And that the sentence at the top of my British passport that says European Union, I will tear that off and eat it. Limit to the eating I'm going to do here.
I wanted to move on to...
Could I just say something
sure.
quickly on that, Dan? It is worrisome. I'll be very quick on this. I'm less worried about Poland than Hungary. They're actually not, in a sense, they're not Eurosceptic. They want a different European Union, an illiberal,
Right.
less tolerant. But more importantly, it doesn't matter that much. Where Germany goes, Europe goes. If Germany and France are solid, we can deal with anything else.
Yeah.
And they look extremely solid.
On the edges, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to continue on this identity theme a little bit. So, Doug, in the play Romeo and Juliet, the question of identity centers on family versus society. What is in a name? Personal versus collective. And as Canada celebrates its 150th anniversary, how is Canadian identity being shaped by what's happening in the USA, Europe, and beyond? And as the play The Breathing Hole elucidates, can Canadian identity even be contemplated without reference to Canada's original inhabitants?
First of all, I love the way that the Stratford program this year is being integrated into these questions, because there's actually great interpretations of these plays as well. I mean, Canadians are very smug at the moment.
At the moment.
Let's just pretend it's something that's erupted also, and I'm not excluding myself from this. And at the same time, maybe are more lucky than skilled at these things. On one level, Europeans do come over here endlessly and say, how is it you don't have one of these right-wing intolerant populist movements and so on? We do have those things. We have had those things. And we've had them at a number of levels. The movement that took over what had been the Progressive Conservative Party, that became the Conservative Party, was from that right populist background. It came out of those movements. And it was only the shrewdness of Stephen Harper during his years as Prime Minister that he realized that to govern sustainably, you had to tell the intolerant branch of your party to shut up and to move off to the side. And you had to spend a lot of time embracing diversity. And I've often said Canada's contribution to the world of conservatism, you could say, has been the idea that the center-right parties can become the parties of diversity. I mean, the Conservatives in Canada spent much of the last decade visiting as many temples and mosques as they could, and trying to say that, okay, the Liberals managed to get multiple generations of Canadians to vote for them by giving them citizenship. Let's try to do that. Let's be the and Jason Kenney would say quite explicitly, he'd say new Canadians, particularly those of religious minority backgrounds, first of all tend to be more religious than average Canadians, so they tend to be social conservatives. And second of all, they tend to be small business people, so they tend to be fiscal conservatives. So why haven't they been voting for our party? Because there's a handful of racists in our party who scare them off. And they did it successfully. In 2011, that milestone was passed where more racial minority Canadians voted conservative than voted liberal for the first time. And that idea was exported. I mean, David Cameron spent a lot of time going to Ottawa and having people from the PMO come to Downing Street to advise him on how to become the Conservative Party of Diversity. Angela Merkel took a lot of ideas from Canada. She made dual citizenship for Germany's 2 million Turks of Germans of Turkish descent, her big election promise in the last election, because she recognized that getting these people on board. So that's the one side of it. But on the other side, we do have right-wing populist movements. I've been living in Toronto since 2013, and when I moved there was a right-wing populist mayor who had a tendency to say very intolerant things about the 50% of the city who were born in another country. and in fact tried to suggest a policy of banning immigrants from entering Toronto, which would have been an interesting logistical challenge. Talk about building a wall. Although paradoxically, and this may also be the interesting Canadian contribution, the people who voted for that racist slogan-spewing right-wing populist anti-immigration mayor tended to overwhelmingly be Canadians of recent immigration and racial minority background. I mean, his coalition was built on his ability to work the evangelical and Pentecostal churches of a lot of communities, to speak the language of the disenfranchised suburban poor who tended to be racial minorities, and so on. Is it possible that somebody could come to power in Canada, maybe not in 5 years, but in 10 years, based on a coalition both of angry middle-class white people and angry people of other backgrounds? That might be Canada's unique contribution to the world. Diverse intolerance.
Just three points. First, we do have to be careful about this. We are doing less well than we used to in Canada at economic integration of migrants. The stats show that there is less easy assimilation into market jobs than there was in the 1970s and 1980s. Second point, for Canada, we can't forget the whole origin story and the complexity of the origin story of Canada. For a long time, the story has been about what Bill MacDonald, who often writes in the Globe and Mail, calls mutual accommodation. But it was mutual accommodation between two founding peoples. And the idea, I come from Quebec, and this was how I grew up. It was all about how the French and English found a way to work together. And it is actually a brilliant story. It's quite remarkable in many ways. Lots of tensions, but ways of working through those tensions over time. And I think that's always been one of the reasons that Canada has been relatively plural, because at its heart, its founding myth is plural, and I think that's important. But as you suggested, Diana, third point, the story of Indigenous peoples was erased from that form of mutual accommodation. And I think the challenge today for Canadians is how to reimagine the mutual accommodation story in a way that also brings in First Nations, Indigenous peoples. And there's no doubt that this is Canada's great shame from a human rights perspective. If you look at all of the great successes that Canada's had, the place where we've had the least success is in bringing Indigenous peoples into the heart of the country, or allowing them to find their own spaces that are acceptable to the broader political framework. So that's what we're struggling with right now, it seems to me.
No, I mean, it's hard to disagree. But I want to drive that point home a bit, because it relates to Canadian smugness on coping with diversity. We have no reason to be smug. When you look at the situation of Indigenous Canadians, First Nations, in terms of unemployment, suicide, alcoholism, family breakdown, all forms of marginalization, they are in a worse situation than any immigrant group in Europe. The suburbs of Paris that everyone talks about are far better. And indeed, they are as bad, if not worse, than the situation of the poorest African Americans without, and I don't know if this is compensation or not, without African Americans' the equivalent of African Americans' massive cultural contribution to the United States. As Stephen said, First Nations have been marginalized. So A, we need less smugness. B, we need to address that. That relates to the identity point. Identity is plural, it's contested, it's diverse, it's overlapping, all of that. But this actually is a country. This is a country with a history. And that history has involved those three groups, one of which has not been included and needs to be included: French, English, and First Nations. And if I have a criticism of the Liberal government, and indeed the Liberal Party since the 1960s, it's that it thinks history and identity are something that can be determined by the state. I still doggedly call it Dominion Day rather than Canada Day. And I think and the Liberals do this all the time, they create this state-generated nationalism as a way of not engaging with the full complexity and richness and diversity of our history. And like all state-generated nationalisms, it comes across as unconvincing, false, unsatisfying. And I think, to give one recent example, there's something, on the one hand, tokenistic about putting a very important black Canadian on the $10 bill, an easy way of claiming there's recognition, rather than incorporating the full history of Afro-Canadians into our school curriculum, into our universities. So on the one hand, it's tokenistic and inadequate, and on the other hand, it's classical Liberal Party politics. I mean, it's oddly enough, it's their man they're displacing. But to take away the longest-serving Prime Minister in the British Commonwealth, who ran the country for 22 years, and view that as something that can just be cast aside, strikes me as odd. So, to sum up all of that, so I'm getting animated, our identity needs to be inclusive, but it also needs to be founded on our history, and it needs to be centered around those three peoples.
I recently finished writing a book called, this is the book plug part of my,
Everyone's allowed one book.
yeah, exactly, titled Maximum Canada, which comes out at the fall, which is a history of Canadian population and exclusion, and also an argument for population growth. And it was a great experience doing the historical research for this, of sort of 300 years of exclusion. It's extraordinary to the extent to which Canada, how fragile the idea of Canada being a place that wanted anybody, how recent it is. I mean, the numbers are extraordinary. Between 1850 and 1950, Canada took in 6.7 million immigrants at a period when 40 million people were leaving Europe. And 6.7 million and 6.2 million Canadians left for other countries, for the United States. We hardly attracted or kept anybody because we had policies very explicitly excluding anybody during much of that period. Most decades of Canadian history before the 1960s, more people left than Canada than arrived. And we had the idea of Canada being two nations, the idea that French Canadians were a people, and were part of Canada, say nothing of three, to say nothing of recognizing Indigenous nations. Right up until about 1967, the two nations idea was, I mean, John Diefenbaker was the opposition leader in 1967, and he argued explicitly there were not two Canadas.
Right.
There were not a thing called French Canadians. They were just British Anglicans who happened to speak French and be Catholic. and Indigenous Canadians, First Nations and Métis and Inuit, only got the vote in 1961. Most Indigenous Canadians who are now alive, either themselves or one of their parents, suffered abuse in a residential school and so on. So this is not stuff in the recent past. The idea, but I would also argue that the notion of Canada as a place of more than three nations, of different identities, is not something that came about as a result of government decree in the 1970s or that sort of thing. The government decrees, I mean, official multiculturalism, which gets a lot of attention, was a policy of integration with a tiny budget.
Yeah.
All that policy really did was it said that people from different backgrounds who are already allowable as immigrants into Canada, had been since 1962, may integrate into their choice of English or French. And there's a Quebec version of it which said they can integrate into their choice of French.
But what about the concept?
But the big changes that took place, I mean, when Canada struck the bilingualism and biculturalism, the Royal Commission in the 1960s, which is the big thing, its big surprise, of course, was the recognition that there was this third force of Canadians. But by the point that was struck, a quarter of all Canadians were already people who were not of British or French or Indigenous descent. It had become a reality on the streets of Canada, in large part because of post-World War II immigration, but also because of the Laurier period immigration and because of the thousands of Chinese and Japanese and Sikhs who'd arrived in the early 20th century and that sort of thing. The reality of Canada had become that thing already. And a lot of that stuff that the Liberal governments did in the early 70s, partly for cynical reasons, to try to shut down Quebec nationalism, to try to get people to vote Liberal, a lot of those things were post facto recognitions of things that had already happened in Canada, that had already happened in the hearts and minds of Canadians.
So is the concept of the mosaic, the Canadian mosaic, viable? Credible?
Canadians have never been as enclavey and mosaic-y as people think. I mean, our cities, yes, sort of have ethnic enclaves that people pass through very quickly. The immigrant groups who've been in Canada the longest are the least likely now to live in. The groups are most likely to live in enclaves. We had a brief experiment of creating official enclaves, which took place between about the 1820s and the end of the 1910s, where we would give ethnic and religious minority groups tracts of land and allow them to self-govern and have their own policies and schools and that sort of thing. That died out pretty quickly with after around the time of the First World War. That idea of enclaves never really caught on. And I think Canada's a lot less like that than we think. I think people see otherwise because we tolerate people integrating and working in Canada before they've learned the language. And that's a big difference from European countries, big difference from the United States in certain respects. We don't mind the first generation having all signs outside their shops that are in Chinese. That's not a sign of enclaves or tolerance of huge cultural differences. It's more simply a recognition that you integrate better when you actually start working.
Yeah, though I think that's the same in the States, actually.
Largely
I think,
it is. Largely it is.
Exactly the same. I mean, I actually agree that entirely, and I've written about this, that the official multicultural policy is actually nothing, because paltry $12 million goes into it, and that is zero.
Most of it goes unspent, too.
Yeah, most goes unspent, and it's actually integrationist when it is spent. And that the Canadian public schools, where the vast majority of migrants, like everyone else goes, basically do the work of integration and assimilation. Two comments, though. Part of the reason, I mean, Toronto, sorry to be Toronto-centric, but Toronto is kind of the experiment of all of this in the country. It's the main destination for migrants. And part of the reasons it's worked is because there hasn't been residential segregation, because Toronto's sprawled out in all directions, sometimes I think like a big cancer.
But no,
And the neighborhoods that were white 30, 40 years ago, Rosedale, Forest Hill, my neighborhood, they remain pretty white. And you've had a gentrification process, which was alluded to, where migrants come in, get money, and then move out to the suburbs, and then basically white yuppies buy these moldy old houses and spend too much money, as I've done, trying to renovate them. But the city remains not a place of residential mixing. So I think part of the reason it's worked is because we have the space that we don't have to avoid the sort of spatial residential conflicts they have in Europe. Second point, identity is incredibly hard to talk about, because when you talk about what's essential to Canadian identity, well, what would that be? That'd be tolerance, openness, we could say, gender rights, rights of sexual minorities, rights of people to freedom of religion. There's nothing Canadian about that. These are universal liberal rights. And so I think everywhere we've come to a point in the West when you try to talk about what national identity is, really nothing is there because you all agree. Well, something is there, but you all agree on it, and there's nothing particular
Don't
about it.
forget poutine. Stephen.
I think one area where we
Hockey,
do
yes.
need to pay close attention is what's happening in some suburban areas politically. One change that I think is taking place is a stronger organizational capacity of certain, I'll call them ethnic groups, often centered around suburbs of large cities. And that is being played upon by some groups within the political party system in ways that I think could actually result in some really negative forces emerging within parliaments, and particularly the federal parliament in Canada. I don't think it's a crisis by any means, and we've always, of course, had organization around ethnicity. It's not new. It's just that it's easier to organize, and I think it can be more effective, and it can actually start to put people into parliament who are there largely not to be representative of Canadians, but to pursue very particular ethnic agendas. And I think we are seeing more of that than we have historically, and we should be careful about it.
I don't know if it's a lot more of that, because there have been periods of that before.
Yes.
I mean, in the 1950s, Canada very quickly had like hundreds of thousands of Italians come into Canada. Sorry to keep going back to Diefenbaker, but he became horrified in around 1958, 1959, that more Italians, and even worse, Southern Italians, who officials within his government had called civilizationally incompatible, literally in memos, more Italians had come into Canada that year than British people had, and tried to stop that by imposing restrictions on family reunification. Immigration aimed specifically at Italians, which was quickly ixnayed within the Prime Minister's office, within the cabinet, when they realized that those Italians had become a huge political force and were sending MP candidates through their own party and the other party and so on. At around the same time, the first politician to use the word multiculturalism in 1961, I think, was a progressive conservative senator of Ukrainian origin who had come in and who had used politics essentially to recognize his own group. That way, it's because the Ukrainian Canadians had become millions by this point, and had used that term multiculturalism in the Senate to describe this idea of both representing Canada and representing your group within it. So that idea of politics, and the same was true when a lot of Eastern European Jews and other groups started to become both the intolerance against them reduced enough that they could enter politics, and they became a political force. So we see cycles of that sort of thing.
So I completely agree, and I suggested we've seen
the rise of Sikhs within both the Liberal and Conservative parties. There's great Punjabi political self-organization. There is also within a lot of the Chinese communities of Canada. So I think we're seeing another generation's version of that.
I think the only difference that I would point to is that it tends to be, as I said, because of all sorts of initiatives around social media, et cetera, easier to organize and therefore potentially more impactful. But the other side of it is closer connections to home countries than would historically have been the case for Italians or Ukrainians, for example. And I think the implications for Canada in its international relations are very different from what we've seen previously. That's the point I'd be concerned about.
Okay. Well, I think I'd like to go a bit into social media. So I'm looking for your questions. I have one more question myself, but please send your questions up. So getting back to media. So School for Scandal. It's all about media and how media can be manipulated. So the sense of alienation, growth of nativist movements, the election of Donald Trump, how much is that a product of media? What are the implications in terms of the use of social media? And can media also be the solution?
Just not to be...
Just because you're the media representative.
Not to be exonerating myself or my
or
institution.
being defensive.
Or being defensive. Honest, it's not our fault. Although, to talk about media and the current politics, and particularly the more extreme politics and the things that we mentioned at the beginning about fragmentation of parties and so on, and to pretend that this is about newspapers and TV is really to miss almost all of it. Almost everything that happens among voters now is not involving things they've read in a newspaper or seen on TV, unless you're the President of the United States, right, and you're TiVoing the previous morning's talk shows and ranting about them on Twitter, mind you. We have a U.S. president who is an extreme outsider who came to power almost entirely because of Twitter, and I would argue that that particular social medium basically is only sustainable now because the U.S. president has become the main voice on it. Most of those things that have happened in Europe are a result of people sharing things on Facebook and Twitter, and what caused these people who live in certain areas to suddenly believe that their country or their continent is being taken over by outsiders who aren't really much of a force in it. It's because they saw something on Facebook that somebody had shared and so on. The power of something that somebody's aunt sent them on Facebook is an extraordinary thing in the world now, or on Weibo in China, or on WeChat in most of the developing world, and that sort of thing. But we have to recognize that there's a great democratic factor in anybody being able to be a journalist. It's something that should be welcomed. The idea of that an instrument of citizenship, such as journalism should have been a cloistered elite thing, was never something to be welcomed. But on the other hand, there are currents and trends within it that we don't really know how to work with yet. We don't know how to deal with an extremely intolerant meme involving a minority group becoming something that huge parts of the population come to believe. We saw that happen in previous centuries in newspapers and so on, and on radio stations and that sort of thing. But now it's media that are actually controlled by the population and by the users, and I think that's the thing we have to face and we don't know how to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I actually disagree on the democratic point. I think it's actually quite, and this might be special pleading for the university, I think it's actually quite dangerous that we lose the idea that before you have a right to speak authoritatively on a subject, you actually have to know something about it. And
you guys with PhDs would say that.
well, that could be an MGA at the Munk School. Applications will be open shortly. Or it could be years of experience in the field. I mean, it doesn't have to be university training. But that basic idea is being lost. And I agree with Doug, though, entirely. I think the media is part of the solution, not the problem. The problem is traditional media. The problem is social media. And I don't see what the solution is. I make a point of engaging with these guys on Twitter and following people Trumpites, people who profoundly disagree with me. And I will tell them very calmly what the truth is and why what they're saying is wrong. There was not, as someone claimed last week, a terrorist attack in Paris a few days ago in which 12 people were killed in a restaurant. And it doesn't make a bit of difference at all. I mean, I've cited this example several times in other fora, one person claimed that the Ottoman Empire was allied with Hitler in World War II to kill the world's Jews. I had to point out the Ottoman Empire ended in World War I.
Yes.
And I was accused of fake history. Would not concede the point. So I think all we can do is actually call it out as lies. The Germans are doing this formally by requiring social media companies to circle fake news as identified as such. And as citizens, to come back to a powerful democratic point, that's what we can all do, is challenge it, call it lies, call it fake news on the web, and hope that it makes a difference.
Yeah.
I would only add that I think one of the challenges we're going to face on this going forward, I agree that the essential problem here is social media. That isn't to say there should not be social media. There will be social media. It will reform itself. I suspect that what we now see as social media will no longer exist in the future, but there will be other forms. What I do wonder about, though, is the complete lack of accountability and responsibility for the companies that create the algorithms that actually serve to divide the population. Because the whole way that you make money through social media is by targeting advertising, by understanding what you already believe and reinforcing it and reinforcing it and reinforcing it through the algorithms. That's a problem, because when there's no capacity through your normal sources of information to ever find something that challenges what you already believe, then I think you get into the kind of situation that Randall's describing, which is people who then attempt to raise questions are inevitably seen as false, because everything else just reinforces what you already believe. And I do think at some level there's got to be responsibility around that within social media companies, and they are going to resist that enormously because they make a hell of a lot of money.
Well, and
I
also,
think that's a problem.
Frankly, which is why the election victory in the United States was partly so worrisome, and I think some of our worst worries were allayed by the collapse of similar movements in most European countries that have faced elections. But I still think it's a huge concern that there are a number of people who've come to believe really hateful, blood libelish conspiracy theories about Muslims, about Jews, about brown-skinned people coming from south of the border of the United States, and who, yes, as Stephen says, the fact that algorithms tend to reward people's desires by giving them people who are similar to them and giving them views that reinforce their own. But the fact that the President of the United States is a prominent figure on there who is relaying these and verifying and supporting a lot of these conspiracy theories and so on, it doesn't help. It means that somebody who's corrected by somebody, you know, from the Munk school or something, who actually has spent time researching these things and knows these things, and then says, well, you're the only one who's ever said this to me, and all these people with green frog pictures seem to be saying otherwise. Maybe I should look further. Then suddenly the President of the United States comes on and says something that seems to confirm that.
Yeah.
That's the worry there. That's the worry
Except
that
that
the spiral now contains a very influential figure.
Totally agree with you, but ultimately there will be, one hopes, democratic accountability there at some level. What I'm suggesting is we don't have any mechanisms currently within the commercial construct for any form of accountability. And I think that's problematic. I share your view totally, Doug, but somewhere along the line,
that's
there
very
can be a
hard to
challenge.
deal with, because you don't want to try to outlaw untruth, because, and I think those of you here who have law degrees will know the extreme difficulty of legislating truth.
And that's never a good idea.
We did have a law against false news until recently, which is a very bad idea, right? I mean, it's as soon as that actually strikes the sort of cold reality of the judicial system, you start to recognize that attempts to define and legislate false news tend to work against themselves.
So we have so many good questions here, so I'm going to break in just a little bit here because I want to get to at least some of them. Is political correctness killing democracy?
I mean, I don't like the word political correctness because I never know what people mean when they say it. And if it means anything, it means you can't say certain things. Well, what we've learned in the last year and a half is that people are saying all sorts of things, false things, inflammatory things, racist things. So no, political correctness is not killing democracy. I was worried that illiberal authoritarianism might kill democracy, but we seem to have turned the corner on that.
Okay. This is a question from a daughter of immigrants married to an immigrant living in a rural area, and it's a good question.
Yeah.
So rural areas have a serious shortage of workers. Our town takes refugees knowing that they will leave. How can it be constructed that they will stay?
One for you, Doug.
We talk about, I mean, most immigration will always be to urban areas because people will generally want to go to places where A, there's work, B, there's people who are like them, who can help them join into the Canadian economy and society, and third, where there's housing that they can afford. But there's also great possibilities to bring people into, again, rural places that have lost certain economic poles, that have lost their general store, that have lost the hotel that governed them. And a lot of rural places have been able to say, let's pick a family from Pakistan or something, bring them in and settle them and welcome them, and have them run the shop, run the hotel, because they're from parts of the world or cultures where they know how to run businesses like that. I mean, look, the TV show Little Mosque on the Prairie was a comedy show, but it was also part of a documentation of this phenomenon in rural Canada, of having one or two families move into a town and become poles of its economy. And that's something that other parts of the world that are really interested in the Canadian experience of rural targeted immigration. Trying to explain why the title Little Mosque on the Prairie is funny to people in European countries was really hard, though.
What is the role of Russia and countries of the former USSR in relation to these issues?
Oh, wow, that's a big one. So obviously, one can't talk about all of the countries that are associated with the former USSR because there's too much diversity there. So maybe I'll just focus only on Russia. And look, it's absolutely clear that there is a strategy that the current leadership in the Kremlin is pursuing to try to undermine Western democracies. And they're doing it by using all sorts of mechanisms usually associated with things we've just talked about, social media, false news. They have armies of trolls that are apparently encouraged to undermine candidates who don't really represent the view that the Kremlin would like to see implemented, which is a form of authoritarianism, I think. So that is actually happening. Now, the really interesting question is, does it have an impact? We're going to find out through a lot of investigations in the United States whether or not there was an ability to shape an actual campaign. That's going to be fascinating. I won't predict the outcome. But I do think it's intriguing that in Europe, it appears that those attempts have not been very successful. So certainly there were attempts in France to directly support the Front National. There have been attempts in Germany to support the Alternative for Deutschland. There were attempts in the Netherlands to support the equivalent party there. And as we said earlier, the populace has, in fact, resisted. So I think we should be attentive to this, and I think we should be concerned about it, but I definitely don't think it's a cause of panic, because luckily, it doesn't seem largely to have worked.
Do you consider the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a serious step towards Canada accepting and integrating its third nation, or another token or political choice? And what about leadership in amongst First Nations? What are the prospects for that?
Look, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is important, but you have to acknowledge that the important directions in Indigenous nations becoming part of sort of a more important part of the Canadian community are not coming from government, or not from, they're coming from within those communities. There's been a really important political awakening during the last decade and a half of Indigenous communities in Canada, First Nations communities, of Inuit communities, caused in part by the fact that there's also been a demographic awakening. They're the fastest growing group in Canada. And there's an impatience within those nations, within those communities, with official things, with government royal commissions and hearings and solutions and that sort of thing. And I think in many ways, while there's a need for Canada to look at its past, to try to correct the terrible tragedies and errors of its past and so on, the change is going to come from within Indigenous communities themselves, pushing for change rather than any sort of slow-moving government action.
Yeah.
I would only add that two things. One, I do think that finally, for the first time in my lifetime, a commission, because I was also involved with the earlier Royal Commission on Aboriginal peoples, I think this resonated more strongly. It's a different era. I think all of the things Doug mentioned are really important. The demographics are crucially important. I do start to see, though, for the first time, institutions, not just governments, but institutions trying to respond. Educational systems, universities, churches, others actually taking on board what was said by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and trying to respond in a serious way. Just one word of warning for the current government. I've been on a couple of panels with young Indigenous peoples, to pick up Doug's point, in the last few weeks, just by happenstance, and I have been struck by a new level of frustration and anger with the current government, because the perception is, amongst many young Indigenous people, that the government has been mouthing the platitudes of inclusion and change and not actually delivering anything, back to Doug's point.
Yeah. I think that's right, but I do want to emphasize Stephen's point that something, not enough to be sure, but something has changed. I mean, at the University of Toronto, we now read out a sibling acknowledgement to the one you heard at the beginning of this event. We're now expanding the number of professors in Indigenous studies, teaching Indigenous languages, Indigenous history, and I think almost most importantly, we're trying to mainstream it into our regular, so not isolate it, make it part of our curriculum. So I taught a course for years on the history of expulsion, forced migration, and I really began that story, as many people do, with Greece and the expulsions following the Greek War of Independence in the 1830s. More recently, I've incorporated the expulsions of North American Indigenous communities into that. And on an incredibly personal note, I think there's lots of family stories here. My grandmother was, my great-grandmother was fully Cree, we believe, anyway, fully First Nation, but this was an entirely suppressed family history. No one talked about it. My grandmother denied being of, as one said in the day, Indian descent. And I think partly because we're having this broader set of societal changes, my own family, for my son, we're starting to rediscover that history. So this won't solve necessarily any of the structural problems we're talking about, but I think we are in a different space than we were 20 years ago.
I'm afraid I just had the signal. Identity is an issue that we could discuss for hours, and I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions, but thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you. Just before we close, I just want to tell you about some other forum events, but this one was extraordinary, and we have more coming throughout the summer. First of all, on Wednesday, June 21st, in the Chalmers Lounge here in the Avon Theatre complex, we're celebrating, in celebration of the National Aboriginal Day, Drew Hayden Taylor, the humorist and playwright, will be joined by Elizabeth Stevens, an elder from the Kettle and Stony Point First Nations, and they will discuss the role of stories and storytelling in Indigenous culture. And then this coming Saturday, a week today, at the Avon Theatre in the afternoon, we have Brent Carver and the Art of Time Ensemble, who are going to be an afternoon of music, celebrating some of the greatest music ever written. So join us for those. To close today, Deanna, thank you for those great questions. Doug was right that you integrated beautifully, and I deeply appreciate that. Doug, thank you for all your experience and coming and joining us, and your willingness to share your own views of things. Randall, wish you the very best. Break a leg in your new responsibilities. And Stephen, thank you for the enormous contribution you've made to the country over the many years, and best of luck on the other side of the pond. Thank you all very much.